we are dedicated to, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to lifelong learning, and we are consecrated and dedicated to the universal brotherhood of humanity. And so we have educational events here year-round. We have seminars and workshops and study circles year-round. And we have been in existence since 1976. And the Institute was founded by the Iyers, Dr. Raghavan Iyer and his wife Nandini Iyer. And they were stalwart supporters of the Institute throughout their lives. And we all learned so much from them. And it is really through them that the existence of the Institute of World Culture has been thriving, really. And so we have programs. We have the study circles, which are actually in recess right now, and they're every Tuesday nights. So anybody who's interested in different study circles, they can join. And tonight, this summer, there will be an ongoing in-person film series, and the next one is on July 9th. And there will be 4 of them this summer. And I will read those out probably at the very end. So today's presentation will be on the revolutionary ideas of Thomas Paine. And this subject was noted by the Santa Barbara Independent to be the best bet for this weekend. So we think that that they are correct. And I wouldn't even call it a bet, I would call it a guarantee. And so we will hear before just practical housekeeping things. The restrooms are over there in that little alcove there, and you turn left and you go in there for that. And the Institute is based on 10 aims, and they are on this brochure, this blue brochure that's in the back of the hall. And I would like to call on Joe Miller to read them for us, if you will. Sure. That'll be great.
Declaration of Interdependence, inaugurated on July 4th, 1976. 1. To explore the classical and Renaissance traditions of East and West and their continuing relevance to emerging modes and patterns of living. 2. To renew the universal vision behind the American dream through authentic affirmations of freedom, excellence, and self-transcendence in an ever-evolving republic of conscience. 3. To honor through appropriate observance the contributions of men and women of all ages to world culture. 4. To enhance the enjoyment of the creative artistry and craftsmanship of all cultures. 5. To deepen awareness of the universality of man's spiritual striving and its rich variety of expressions in the religions, philosophies, and literatures of humanity. 6. To promote forums for fearless inquiry and constructive dialogue concerning the frontiers of science, the therapeutics of self-transformation, and the societies of the future. 7. To investigate the imaginative use of the spiritual, mental, and material resources of the globe in the service of universal welfare. 8. To examine changing social structures in terms of the principle that a world culture is greater than the sum of its parts, and to envision the conditions, prospects, and possibilities of the world civilization of the future. 9. to assist in the emergence of men and women of universal culture, capable of continuous growth in nonviolence of mind, generosity of heart, and harmony of soul. And finally, 10, to promote universal brotherhood and to foster human fellowship among all races, nations, and cultures.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Joe. So it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Maurice Bischoff here, who will be presenting today. And he has been a member of the Institute since 1985 and has given many presentations over the years, including one entitled Real Utopias of Humane and Inclusive Social Experiments Throughout the World. He was born in Los Angeles. His favorite song is Randy Newman's song, I Love LA. And he went to its two universities, the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, pursuing a political science degree, and at the University of Southern California, pursuing a doctoral degree in public administration. You know, you're the most modest guy about your PhD I think I've met anybody ever. Dr. Maurice Bisheff. He has always been interested in rational, participative models of social change and worked as an organizational consultant doing team building with police departments and large-scale participative strategic planning with communities such as a Children's Protective Service in Tulare County and a strategic plan of establishing the first neighborhood council in Los Angeles between the University of Southern California and its multicultural residents and institutions. Here comes the romance. It was at the Institute of World Culture where he met his wife, Jennifer, and was introduced to broader ideas of political philosophy and an expansive view of world culture in the light of lifelong learning. He participates in nearly all of the Institute's activities and was recently appointed to be on the board of the Institute of World Culture. So congratulations. How appropriate it is for Maurice to give this Founders Day address on Thomas Paine Day, a subject he himself first learned about here at the Institute. Subsequently, Maurice became a board member of the citizen group Thomas Paine Friends Incorporated. He led a walk on the East Coast to important sites of Thomas Paine's work to raise awareness of Paine's contributions to America and to the world. So without any further ado, Dr. Maurice Bischoff.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I certainly have a great gratitude, as many of us do, to the founders of the Institute of World Culture, and also a great gratitude to all of you for spending some time here today, and including those virtually, some of whom may be listening from around the world. Before I start my presentation, I think an inevitable question is, if I want to learn about Thomas Paine, what book should I get? So the book is Thomas Paine, Enlightenment, Revolution, and the Birth of Modern Nations by Craig Nelson, which you should be able to find even in bookstores or on Amazon. It's written 2006. So this is the recommended if you wanted to go through the full biography of Thomas Paine in that sense. Well, Thomas Paine started with this wonderful phrase, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And this is the keynote of the radical revolutionary Thomas Paine.
Was that his sentence?
Yes, that's his sentence. And I'm going to be quoting from him throughout the presentation, actually. To get a little introductory seminar as well as a roadmap to what we're going to cover in Paine's life, Mark Phillip from the Oxford World Classics on excerpts from Paine's writings writes this paragraph of introduction, which I think kind of provides a roadmap for us. Before 1775 and 1815, from the beginning of the American Revolution to the end of the French, the meaning of the term revolution changed dramatically. In the mid-18th century, revolution involved a change in government, and in a more specialized sense, a return to basic principles of a constitution. It had no connotations of progressive and permanent change. By the beginning of the 19th century, in the lexicon of reformers and radicals, the term had come to mean a process of rapid, fundamental, and progressive social and political change. Reform efforts were no longer directed by backward-looking concerns with original constitutions or an uncorrupted state. Instead, they became linked to a belief in the advance of mankind from barbarism to civilization, based on the spread of the Enlightenment ideas and the recognition of the inalienable rights of man. No individual's writing and action exemplifies this transformation of the language of social and revolutionary change than that of Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809, unquote. Now, Paine had a wide circle of acquaintances and was a man of multiple citizenships, so to speak. He played a major role in the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And no man has a better claim to be one of the world's first modern international global citizens than Thomas Paine, recognized as such by the United Nations in 1989. He wrote, "Independence is my happiness, and I view things as they are, without regard to place or person. My country is the world, and my religion is to do good." Paine participated in many circles, some of those of a spiritual or religious nature, and many of a political nature, although the distinctions were really quite blurred back then. He appealed to a human faculty called common sense, which all human beings possess, though modern materialized psychologists have yet not noted this faculty of human nature. But Paine did, and he was obsessed with how society can help draw out this common sense. And he provided somewhat of a roadmap through an interwoven ideas of impersonal spirituality, philosophical reasoning, and an ever-expanding inclusive fellowship, recognizing nature's interdependence. Thus, as we hope to portray today, Thomas Paine paints a picture of us, for us, of the elements of the ideal mental posture of a citizen. And I'm aware my physical posture is not always very good, but then of course our mental postures might not be always so good either. But Paine paints this picture. Now you might ask, what is a mental posture? A mental posture might consist of an attitude of mind and the ability to hold a sacred trust within oneself, whether you call it the higher self or one's active conscience. And that sacred trust is with universal ideas and principles that not only one is devoted to, but one attempts to live by. That this provides the structure, if you will, of a mental posture of a true democratic citizen, certainly in Paine's eyes. Here are some quotes from Paine which kind of point to this. Moderation in temper is always a virtue, but moderation in principle is always a vice. An army of principles can penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. I love the man that smiles in trouble, that can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. 'Tis the business of little minds to shrink, but he whose heart is firm and whose conscience approves his conduct will pursue his principles unto death. I feel myself hurt when I hear the Union, the great palladium of liberty and safety, the least irreverently spoken about. It is the most sacred thing in the Constitution of America, and that which every man must be proud and tender of. Our citizenship in the United States is our national character. Indeed, the cultivation of these virtues, which are really not attributes so much as powers that people have in them, is a way to awaken human potential, and they provide the substratum for liberty, equality, and fraternity, the triad of peaceful democratic self-governance. These universal principles then would become the radical touchstone for regenerating individuals and society in the service of humanity, or in Paine's words, a universal society. So who was Thomas Paine? Well, first, some caveats. Thomas Paine was neither a saint, a sage, nor a perfect being. He was not a logical armchair philosopher. He was an original thinker, a synthesizer, or in Paine's own words, he was a gardener of ideas and a catalyst for action in the service of mankind. Thus, he was more than a pamphleteer or a moral philosopher and activist, and even more than a revolutionary. For he laid down lines of thought and action consistent with the compassionate wisdom of the ages. Yet, there is no statue honoring Thomas Paine in Washington, D.C., and only one thumbnail postage stamp ever issued in his honor in the United States. The other one, a Polish stamp with Washington, Paine, and Kosciuszko. There is a beautiful bust of Thomas Paine to be placed in the US Congress, where it is still refused. It resides in the American Philosophical Society, where Paine was a member. There are individuals and citizen groups, such as Thomas Paine Friends, Inc., who have petitioned for decades for a statue in Washington, D.C., or a postage stamp, or even a Thomas Paine holiday. There are many groups in America who honor Thomas Paine's birthday today, and a handful of statues of Paine on the East Coast of America. Paine has directly influenced American leaders, especially President Abraham Lincoln, with the core value of unity as constituting a nation. Presidents like Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama honor his inspiration and rhetoric. There is a statue in Paris, France. There is no statue in Washington, D.C. Well, who was Thomas Paine? Thomas Paine, without the E at the end, was born in England in 1737. His father was a member of the Society of Friends, a Quaker, and was a staymaker. His mother was a member of the Church of England. At age 12, Paine was out of school, and he learned to be a staymaker. He witnessed, however, as many did, the public hangings and cruelties around him in that society as he grew up. With the Society of Friends, he did get a good moral education. Paine was restless, and in 1756, left home and became a privateer on a ship. That earned him enough money to come back and study at the Royal Society of Science, for he was always interested in science. Then he had to earn a living and opened up a staymaking shop. He married Mary Lambert, but she died a year later. To support himself, he learned mathematics and entered the excise service as an intern in 1764, but talked back to his superiors and was dismissed from that position. In 1766, he moved to London and became an English instructor, but was able to return as an excise collector in England again. With his second appointment to the excise service in 1768, this time in the Sussex town of Lewes, he made his first foray into politics, where he became a member of the Society of 12, an unelected, self-perpetuating oligarchic town council that oversaw town business. With 4,000 residents and a long tradition of self-government, Lewes had a coffee shop for discussion and debate, a theater that played comic opera and Shakespearean plays, a lending library, a sizable dissenting community, and a large tavern called the White Hart Inn, which was the center of the town's social and political life. One might comment that sometimes drinking water was not so pure back then. Taverns seemed to be the next best thing. Paine managed town affairs from the White Hart, ensuring that the streets were clean, that stray dogs and cats, pigs and cows were picked up, and that the two constables did their duty. In 1769, however, his landlord died, and for inheritance and other reasons, he married the landlord's eldest daughter, but the marriage was never consummated. As an excise officer, Paine was recognized soon for his rhetoric and was asked to represent the officers, asking for a raise, petitioning a raise to Parliament, pleading general want and desperation of poverty. Paine was dismissed, and that was the end of that. He tried to run a tobacco shop, and he did separate from his wife on good terms. But in 1772, he befriended through a tutor, Ed Gibbon, John Bevans, and an American named Benjamin Franklin. Franklin saw something in Paine, including his talent for rhetorical debate and an openness to new ideas, and wrote him a letter of introduction to his friends who were leaders in the colonies of America. Paine decided to make the journey to America. Paine became bedridden after the journey. That Atlantic journey was a tough one. Nonetheless, he recovered, and arriving in New York and making his way to Philadelphia, he met Benjamin Franklin's son-in-law, Richard Bache, who introduced Paine to publishing. Paine became the editor of a new journal, the Pennsylvania Magazine. It published tracts on the evils of slavery, education for women, and other revolutionary ideas. Paine himself never owned a slave. An example would be one excerpt from the article African Slavery in America in 1775, though it's now disputed whether Paine really wrote it, but certainly Paine was the editor who approved it. Quote, "How just, how suitable to our crime is the punishment with which Providence threatens us. We have enslaved the multitudes and shed much innocent blood in doing it, and now are threatened with the same ourselves. And while others' evils are confessed and bewailed, why not this, especially and publicly, than which no other vice, if all others, had brought us so much guilt on the land?" It certainly sounds contemporary. But what overtook Paine within 3 months of arrival were the events at Lexington and Concord in 1775. Paine was amazed at the new world, a new world that had a new atmosphere, new wildlife, new ecology, new peoples, new frontiers. It truly was different from the old world. And Paine said, quote, "The country set fire about my ears almost the moment I got into it." Dr. Benjamin Rush, his mentor, asked Paine to produce a pamphlet at this time, giving reasons for the separation of the colonies from the British Empire. And he grasped the opportunity. Paine called the pamphlet Plain Truth, but Benjamin Rush called it Common Sense. Paine agreed. Its first printing and distribution were in January of 1776, and it was anonymous because this treasonous pamphlet was, quote, Paine's words, "to rescue man from false principles and enable him to be free." It attacked the hereditary monarchies and proclaimed self-governance for the American colonies. Along with his initial pamphlet of Common Sense, Paine wrote treatises on liberty based on the spiritual equality of man and an inner vision of a partial inner vision of the future. Paine wrote, "When the truth designs to come, her sister liberty will not be far. Truth, the fountain of happiness, the harbinger of freedom, the basis of justice, and the source of judgment. By exploring this sacred and invaluable principle, evil is exterminated and good is produced. It is the province of all ranks of society, from prince to beggar, to seek it, and it is only to be found by dispassion and fair reflection. By giving free scope to the imagination and full discussion and promulgation of every sentiment, wherever it may spring, this sacred guide to action will be ascertained." He also wrote a poem called Liberty Tree. Liberty Tree was a famous elm tree that stood in Boston near the Boston Commons in the days right before the American Revolution. In a chariot of,
Sorry to do that, but could you hold the papers down so it's
yeah. In a chariot of light from the regions of day, the goddess of liberty came. 10,000 celestials directed the way, and hither conducted the dame. A fair budding branch from the gardens above, where millions and millions agree, she brought in her hand a pledge of her love, and the plant she named Liberty Tree. The celestial exotic struck deep in the ground, like a native if it flourished and bore. The fame of its fruit drew the nations around to seek out this peaceable shore. Unmindful of names or distinctions, they came. For freedom, like brothers, agree. With one spirit endued, they one friendship pursued, and their temple was Liberty Tree. Beneath this fair tree, like the patriarchs of old, their bread and contentment they ate. Unvexed with the troubles of silver and gold, the cares of the grand, the great. With timber and tar, they old England supplied, and supplied her power on the sea. Her battles they fought without getting a groat for the honor of Liberty Tree. But here, O ye swain, tells a tale most profane, how all the tyrannical powers, kings, commons, and lords, are uniting amain to cut down this guardian of ours. From the east to the west, blow the trumpeter to arms. Through the land, let the sound of it flee. Let the far and the near all unite with a cheer in defense of our Liberty Tree. So Paine had this tremendous optimism about his view that this new country could be united by interest, reason, and sentiment. That it is by common sense that the collective good could no longer be served by subservience to Britain. While appealing to the naturalness and reasonableness of the common cause, Paine also appeared to virtue. And again, virtue can be synonymous with power, ethical power. His readers should not mistake, quote, a cold matter of interest for the demands of their bounden duty. They must be prepared to pay the cost of their just resistance, not solely by reference to interests, but by those feelings and affections which nature justifies, and without which we should be incapable of discharging the social duties of life or enjoying the felicities of it. And that was part of the common sense pamphlet. Well, Paine was in Philadelphia and most likely met Thomas Jefferson. Paine, an Englishman, was not formally involved in the Declaration of Independence. However, for many decades, it was noted that Jefferson's style of writing was not like Paine, and that Paine may have had a hand in drafting elements of the Declaration of Independence as it went through 3 drafts. It was only a few years ago that the Holy Grail for Painites was found. That a drafting committee's draft of the Declaration actually had Paine's notes with a TP on it. A manuscript copy of an early version of the Declaration thus emerged, and we can refer to this document as the Sherman copy, since it was used to inform Roger Sherman of the draft status of the Declaration of the committee during the 4th week of June, 1776. Nonetheless, the Declaration of Independence, with one's unalienable rights to revolt against some government, the government as a last resort, was passed on July 4th, 1776. And by December 1st, Paine was a correspondent, a war correspondent to General Nathanael Greene, and later with George Washington in the field. This is when the ragtag, volunteer, underpaid Continental Army were fighting the trained professional British Army and really needed some propping up, where George Washington needed to keep soldiers on the battlefield. Paine wrote a series of crisis papers, and especially when the Continental troops began losing battle after battle, retreating and giving away colonial cities. They were on the verge of defeat. But they did have a plan with Washington to make a sneak attack. It could be one of their last efforts. Paine was with the troops that night, and this is what he said. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. In a major turnaround, Washington's army began to win some victories, and with significant help from the French government and others, withstand over time the British onslaught until finally the Treaty of Paris in 1783. In 1781, though, Paine visited France as a member of a diplomatic delegation seeking aid for the American war effort. And when Paine returned and the treaty was signed, he realized this large continent needed more. Free societies, Paine believed, would work only insofar as their citizens could communicate with one another. Paine now needed to make a living again, and so he embarked on designing a single-span iron bridge. This bridge could span the many waterways of the new United States of America, which he named, by the way, and encourage healthy commerce. But he could not find a backer. He did go in 1787 to Europe to promote his idea of a new iron bridge. But again, events overtook him. He was never able to find funding for his single-span iron bridge. But he did join Jefferson in France, along with the Marquis de Lafayette and his very good friend that is not usually mentioned much, Nicolas de Bonneville. And soon after, he met Condorcet and some of the other French philosophers at the time. Ever the humanitarian, existing in societies of cruelty, he continued to challenge the British claims, saying, quote, "Instead of civilizing, the empire has tended to brutalize mankind." Meanwhile, Paine, an Englishman by birth, an American by sentiment, becomes a world citizen. He says, "My attachment is to all the world and not to any particular part." This is an expression of Paine's idealism for a universal society, that we can make the world over again. Not a pangloss of uniformity, but of a healthy diversity where mutual communication and trade, both in ideas and commerce, will create a higher sense of unity of all mankind. And he proposed a league between nations of commerce in order to sublimate their warring tendencies, especially in the European states. Well, he also espoused Republican principles of government and society based on the idea of a republic. So what is a republic? Quote, "What is called a republic is not any particular form of government. It is the object for which government ought to be instituted and on which is to be employed res publica, the public affairs or the public good, or literally translated, the public thing." Now, this, of course, is in contrast to kings and monarchs and dictators, where the government is for the private use of the whim of a private interest, not for a public interest. Paine had already worked out a lot of these Republican ideas when he got to Europe. And some of them came about because in America, he researched what it would be like for a state of a natural society, which looked like the situation of the first settlers of America. Indeed, he and Benjamin Franklin were influenced by their direct contact with the Iroquois Confederation of Nations on the East Coast. For Paine, the only legitimate government was a representative republic. And he proposed the primacy of universal natural rights that each human being had over the particular rights of British subjects, which could be taken away by the king. Thus, the American Revolution seemed to have some kind of transformational outcomes, both for the country itself and reverberating through Europe. One is a democratic republic, this res publica, transformed subjects into citizens. There is always the problem of sovereignty and the legitimacy of a regime, which would be based on the representative participation of citizens in the guise of their natural rights. Paine called for a quasi-universal suffrage, at least for men, annual elections, and a council of censors, which Paine called a provincial jury, in a note in his 4 letters. And what I can imagine this to be is a civil grand jury, which we have all over the United States, including Santa Barbara, which I think is looking for members, by the way. He emphasized the importance of political participation, and he wrote, "We are a people of experiments." Now, this revolution, though, should not simply be seen as a revolution of legal structure. In fact, it was a revolution based on self-awareness. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, George Washington alluded to it as the catalyst of revolution because it changed the minds of men. Self-awareness does presuppose a spiritual quality of consciousness and equality of all people to be able to look inward, contemplate, and express themselves. Thus, awareness allows one to begin to define oneself in relation to one's community. If India is the continent of spiritual continuity, certainly America is the continent of definition and redefinition of who one is in relationship to our community. Secondly, Paine and other founding fathers espoused the universal basis of human rights. And this, of course, included free speech, free assembly, and also freedom of religion, which would be constituted in a written constitution, not just an informal one. Freedom of religion became most important in this new American Republic because it separated church and state, so that no person could belong to a favored state religion or state-sponsored religion, which could diminish the actions of citizens in other sub-state religions. Thus, the American Revolution became a revolution leading to a society of non-dogmatism, an open society with tolerance and civility for all in the search for truth. That doesn't mean there weren't dogmas or beliefs, but it wasn't based on a dogmatism per se. And that allowed for freedom. These are 2 major contributions then, but Paine went on and to talk about the relationship between government and society, and this is the sticky wicket. Some writers have, he said, so confounded society with government that it left little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness, positively uniting our affections. The latter negatively by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. Paine did have a lot of wisdom, however, because what he also said was that unavoidably, citizens would relax their duties and attachments to others in society, thus leaving government to supply the defect of moral virtue. So as government and society became more complex and interdependent, you needed more laws and a better legal system to begin to handle the complexity of commerce and the complexity of a greater interdependence than you would have in a rural society in which they themselves live. So Paine was aware that government sometimes has to supply the defect of moral virtue. Paine also knew, though, that it would take dialogue, experiment, human empathy, and communication to bring people along. Quote, "There never yet was any truth or principle so irresistibly obvious that all men believed it at once. Time and reason must cooperate with each other to the final establishment of any principle." Thus, for Paine and others, duty in pursuit of truth is the basis of an active responsibility of the democratic citizen, the duty that supports this mental posture of a citizen. It is not only the basis of a moral coherence of a community, but is a vital corrective when natural human tendencies of excessive greed and ambition, accompanied by exaggerations or even outright disregard for truth, come about. Thus, to protect the dialogue, you need to have a sense of democratic norms and how those democratic norms support the rule of law. Because as was said in the Revolution, and Paine said it too, you need a government of laws, not men. The government of laws help shape and protect and hold accountable the vital, peaceful dialogue. Over time, people come to trust in the law and principles as being less arbitrary, though imperfect in practice, than a personal whim of a king or a dictator. This was the basis of the impetus of many early modern revolutions, and is still a very fundamental factor for, it's even the basis of our banking and economic system. You can't have investment if there's an arbitrary whim in changing the law or the rules. So you can't have a prosperous economy without some agreed upon laws that have some agreed upon fairness. Now, Paine believed that, however, that natural law can transcend positive law. He believed in an intuitionist vision of truth and natural law, rather than today's monopoly of positive law. Natural law is that which our common sense and reason tell us are due to man and nature. Paine argues that individuals should be able to exercise their natural intuitions and aspirations and their corresponding natural right to do so without government. This is the anarchist element in Paine, but Paine was not a full anarchist. However, Paine would also suggest that a lot of these aspects that people wish cannot be done without the cooperation of others, because we are part of a civil society, and that some of these natural laws must be seen in relation to the civil rights of others. Individuals, by agreeing to erect forms of government, may give up part of their liberty for that purpose, and is the particular business of a constitution to make out how much they should give up. Every civil right, Paine writes, has its foundation some natural right, pre-existing in the individual, but to the enjoyment of which is individual power, is a distinction between those natural rights in which the power to execute is as perfect as the right itself, as in freedom of conscience. But there are also other rights that the power of the individual is imperfect because they cannot complete what they want without other members of society. Now, Paine agreed with the pioneering English philosopher John Locke that people came together in society voluntarily and formed government to protect their rights to life, liberty, and for Locke, property. It was clear to Paine that those who had governed long ago took from people their liberty and used all manner of coercive powers to maintain power. Wherever possible, the state had embraced and captured the church to further cement its control. Now, most academic thinkers might see Paine accepting John Locke's view of association and the right of property through the laws of Parliament. Conscience for Locke in this system was a feeling that people had about the laws passed by Parliament and the norms and the proper norms that took place. But for Paine, the mind is not a blank screen or a tabula rasa, as it is for Locke, but rather the human mind has an a priori common sense, a deep feeling of inherent inner conscience and intuition that is not dependent on external images, forces, customs, and laws, but one associated with the deep intuition of natural law. Thus, Paine's social contract between the individual and society is not the same as Locke's, and America was not formed on the basis of John Locke's social contract, but as a freedom and a republic of conscience, much more in the Painite view in this way. Now, there is the problem, of course, of the less virtuous and the less able inheriting a great legacy from the strong. We know that in families as well as in politics. So democratic republics have to be seen as continually renewing, not settling down. Government being a contingent experiment in constitution building, and most importantly, in living and maintaining a constitution on a day-by-day basis. So when you see someone crossing the street against the red light at 11 o'clock at night on a little street here in Santa Barbara, but not a little one, a major thoroughfare, what would you do as a citizen? Would you honk at them? Would you just let it slide and not get involved?
Would yell.
I honked at them after they left, I honked on it. But I was aware that I had some kind of a citizen duty on a day-to-day basis to uphold their safety, because they could get hit by a car as well as not just breaking the law. So that's the question that are posed to all of us of how do we make a constitution a living constitution on a day-by-day basis. Now, for Paine and Jefferson in the early modern period, the largest population of the city might be 30,000 people or less. Popular, accessible, participative government then was available. Again, one can use your imagination. When is the last time you lived in a city that was under 20 or 30,000 people? It was certainly maybe a different experience than living even in Santa Barbara. Paine and Jefferson declared that every generation should review their constitution. That is what constitutes them, their fundamental values, and a charter, and they could review and self-correct. But this requires a looking within and a trimming away, individually and collectively, of excess and exaggeration, and a reaffirmation of values, a new look at tolerance, civility, unity, and justice, which sustain a polity. Local government, though, is the workshop for citizen Democrats, that is, Democrats with a small d. This is where a living constitution becomes developing skills with your neighbors and your children developing skills in reasoning together over concrete issues about the common good. Even in a modern world where we can bring people together with experts We should do so to integrate perspectives, not to compromise. And that different perspectives need to be wielded through creative imagination into proposed policy experiments, which can strengthen the public trust. Paine even heightened the idea of merit. The governing principle changed its ratio of assigning reality to an arbitrary loyalty to a king, a loyalty system, to the idea of merit and to some extent rationality. Essential merit resembled honor, the public's verdict on someone's qualities, but with the difference that an individual's honor consisted of his assessment of how others assessed his performance, while his merit lay in his imagining of the inner quality that accounted for his performance. Merit and honor were cousins of character, a word that today connotes inner rectitude, but also meant the reputation of a man on stage. In contrast to our more egalitarian's familiarity with personality and with ethnic or religious identity, merit involves connoting the difference in a hierarchy of performance, starting with an apprenticeship, going into a craft, and other hierarchies of expertise combined with real experience and practice. So these were all modern ideas and that Paine really articulated. And he did go to France and he did debate Edmund Burke, a colleague in England. And Paine published The Rights of Man in response to Burke's reflection on the revolution of France when it kind of went sour. Burke's essential premise was that the precedent and authority were natural sources of identity and legitimacy over time, and that radical revolution would dissolve the sovereign and to be so disorderly as to be cruel. And certainly the French Revolution could provide examples of that. Paine defended the cause of revolution, destabilizing existing orders, through Republican government as an ongoing experiment. Paine had a transformative concept of time where Burke had a repetitive vision of it. Paine is on an evolutionary dimension of time, basing his conclusion that monarchy was archaic and fixed, whereas Republican institutions were adapted to modern times. In Britain, Paine's Rights of Man outsold Burke's publication. Paine was prosecuted for sedition in England, less for what he said than for the fact that that his readings were not confined to the judicious reader, but instead reached those minds whose minds cannot be supposed to be conversant with subjects of this sort, the ignorant, the credulous, the desperate. But Paine argued ignorance is remedial through knowledge and reason, and that all human beings had common sense. Nonetheless, in France, Paine had a whole other career practically and briefly. He wrote The Rights of Man, both their first and second editions, and that was his first contribution to the French Revolution. The second was Paine's shift from a position of an observer to an active participant or agent in the events of the revolution. In 1791 to December 1793, corresponding to France's first Republican debates and experiments, he landed in Calais, became a representative at the French Convention, and after the monarchy was abolished in August of 1792, he became involved with Condorcet in influencing the French Declaration of Human Rights, a model for the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. He also, as a delegate, voted on the need for the primary assembly not to ratify the death sentence of Louis XVI in January of 1793. but rather just simply to exile him to America, because he did not believe in violent revenge. He and his colleagues lost the vote. The next phase, unfortunately, was when the revolution turned more violent, and revolution and Republican principles proved incompatible. Paine was jailed in December of 1792 as the terror increased and was sentenced to death. A mysterious mark or lack of marking on his cell, however, let him escape the daily guillotine. At the Luxembourg prison, he worked on the second edition of the Rights of Man, and he was finally released from prison in November 1794 in ill health. And wondering why George Washington didn't get him out sooner, given his contribution to America. And Paine later warned Washington about cozying up to the British, maybe having a vision that the War of 1812 might begin to precipitate later. While in France, however, Paine wrote a lot about the inequality of rights. In fact, he made this amazing statement. They wrote, "The inequality of rights has been the cause of all disturbances, insurrections, and civil wars that ever happened in any country, in any age of mankind." Well, let's not qualify anything. Let's really say it is. It was the cause of the American Revolution. It was the cause of the French Revolution, and also of the civil wars in England in the time of Charles and Cromwell. Well, it is interesting that the current French intellectual, Thomas Pickering, when the economist, French economist, who writes now about inequality, echoes the same historical evolution, not just of what's happening now, but what's happened for 200 or 300 years. In a pamphlet then wrote Common Agrarian Justice, Paine elaborated on minimal economic rights. And this is the one that's neglected by Americans, because Americans are usually on liberty. So they kind of neglect the other piece of Paine's Agrarian Justice. Paine, of course, signaled this already, his ideas, when he said in the Rights of Man, "No man is capable, without the aid of society, of supplying his own wants." Now, Paine argued in Agrarian Justice that some people are able to work with the earth to create something of value for themselves and others, and to society. Each cultivator of land brings forth food, maybe, or enriched soil. Indeed, they should be rewarded for their work. However, they owe to the community a ground rent for the use of the land they so-called own or are entrusted with. Why? Because no one owns the earth. The earth is for everyone. The earth is universal. And for those people who maybe went to school or learned a language, they didn't do that, someone taught them that. So there's a fundamental interdependence with nature and with human beings, such that while people can be rewarded and even prosper for their initiative and their boldness and their risk-taking, there is also the idea that they can't do, that they didn't do it just themselves out of the blue, but in fact, owe all human beings a rent for using the earth, its minerals, its resources, its knowledge in order to do it. So the problem is not the earth. The problem is the value we attach to the earth, certain things. And the problem may not be inequality per se, but the widening of inequality. And this comes down to the fact that when people own assets like land, the value of the improvement to their assets is based on social expectations, like location, location, location for real estate, or good profit with a balance sheet and good R&D for a company for a stock. So these are social expectations of relative worth of an asset. And an owner then receive some form of rent from their land or stock dividends or something, such that over time, there is a sub-society that's created called a rentier society, a rentier class. And we see today capitalist societies having two economies, and one of them is an asset economy. For those who have assets, and some of whom have concentrations of wealth far greater than nations themselves, they profit on getting rents from others. That's different than a normal economy where people work for a living, or small-scale entrepreneurs risk their funds, all their funds maybe, in order to develop a small business. The difficulty, of course, is that laws are made to favor, if not protect, asset-based investments under the guise that they can create more assets, hence an asset-based fueling of economic growth. Unfortunately, experience has showed us that over time, this widens the gulf between rich and poor, the haves and the have-nots. The increasing concentration of vital societal assets by privately owned and held entities, especially food and agriculture, and the ties with national leaders to set laws in regard to them, does not necessarily lead to an expansive public good, even if the prices might be a little bit cheaper in the short run. And they can threaten the poor and the landless with undue political and economic coercion. In other words, selfishness can't really lead to a great end. It can't be glorified too much because it doesn't respond to principle. And remember, Paine says that the moral posture of a citizen is for the common good and for the principles of the whole, for unity. Paine wrote in his time, quote, "The present civilization is as odious as it is unjust. The contrast of the affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together." Thus, Paine called for progressive taxation, a universal income, and other means not to destroy the incentives for investment in prosperity by any means, but rather to provide for basic subsistence and basic rent that is due to all citizens. Well, Paine was also involved in France at this time in spiritual and religious groups, more openly, as a matter of fact. And he participated in circles that expressed the need for an impersonal spirituality as an invaluable aid to freedom of thought. Paine belonged to many circles and termed himself a theophilanthropist, a lover of God and man. His deity, however, was not an anthropomorphic or even a revealer, but he felt the word God is the power of the first cause. Not the first cause, but the power of the first cause. And he felt that one could never name the first cause itself because it would be man circumscribing with the concept deity, circumscribing the eternal, circumscribing the oneness, the one without a second. So Paine's deism was not an anthropomorphic God, a father figure who had fits and acted kind of arbitrarily to punish someone. Rather, it was based on natural religion, which was based on laws that were universal. Paine's deism was of a supreme source, but a source not a distant initiator, like some deists said, whose God the clock moving and then stood by and watched it in a mechanical way, in mechanical science at that time, but rather of both a transcendent and immanent God, the God of intelligent spirit or wisdom that was both without and within each person. Now, in order to study God and the universe God created, Paine directed his fellow human beings to the study of science. Quote, "We can have only a confused idea of his power if we have not the means of comprehending something of its immensity. We can have no idea of his wisdom, but by knowing the order and manner in which it acts. The principles of science lead to this knowledge, for the creator of man is the creator of science. And it is through that medium that man can see God, as it were, face to face." He said, "It is only through the exercise of reason that man can discover God. Take away reason, he would be incapable of understanding anything." So this certainly went against the religions of the day and the revelations of the day. He did also suggest that we would be able to contemplate the power, wisdom, and benignity of the deity in his works, and the key phrase, and endeavor to imitate him in everything moral, scientific, and mechanical. He-Man would then conceive far beyond what church theology can teach him, the power, knowledge man has of science and the munificence of the creator. And by where he renders his situation comfortable here, it is derived from this source. His mind, exalted by this scene and convinced by that fact, his being ours, would increase in gratitude as it increased in knowledge. Thus, Paine points a sensibility, this moral posture of being a citizen, to its source, to bring the ever-present transcendent into the ever-awakening immanent in every human being. And that becomes the basis of human potential and the source of common sense coming alive. Paine states the duty of man consists of 2 points: his duty to God, which every man must feel, and with respect to his neighbor, to do as he would be done by. Yet, one must be forward-looking in self-transcendence through reason. For Paine's reason is a spiritualized reason in order to bring forth common sense from the light of intuition, lighting up the mind and its ever-expanding orbits for learning and self-correction. In a sense, we can all reenact in our own way the myth of Prometheus, which is the lighting up of the mind by the gods. But common sense is very important. And this is how Paine spoke about this intuition. Paine said there are 2 distinct classes of what are called thoughts: those we produce by our reflection and the act of thinking, and those that bolt into the mind of their own accord. I have always made it a rule to treat these voluntary visitors with civility, and it's from them that I have acquired almost all the knowledge I have. So Paine is suggesting that he offers nothing more in Common Sense, chapter 3, of offering nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. And in chapter 3 of Sophia Rosenfeld's book on common sense, she says, quote, "Common sense is here clearly to signify an irrefutable 18th century British usage, a basic, instinctive, immediate form of perception and judgment natural to all humans, a direct universal insight about the good as best we are able to absorb it. It also may mean that the basic axioms or maxims derived from a universally shared human capacity, a critical source of wisdom, inconvertible and self-evident knowledge, becomes the best evidence of all. And certainly the Declaration of Independence was declared by Thomas Jefferson to be the common sense of the subject. In short, Paine adopted the Enlightenment ideal and put it into practice to make the idea more real through reasoning from universal principles and using our own self-devised efforts and self-correction in practice, thus developing and awakening human potential and awakening and strengthening the mental posture of all of us as citizens. Well, in 1802, Thomas Paine returned to North America from France, arriving first at Baltimore. Welcomed back by Thomas Jefferson, now in the presidency, and by numerous others, Paine's religious writings, as I just noted, were not mentioned in the Republican press. Jefferson's opponents, the Federalists, were not inclined to leave Paine alone if attacking him could harm Jefferson's reputation as well. Paine, now over 60 years old, often ill and sometimes ill-tempered, lashed out at the press. Despite the fact that a good many of the revolutionary leaders shared Paine's spiritual belief in deism, they pragmatically realized that the America of the early 19th century made it so that Paine's attack on organized religion was foolish politically. Even Paine's staunch friend Samuel Adams broke with him because he thought Paine had declared himself to be an atheist. Writing to Adams, Paine tried to explain, the case, my friend, is that the world has been overrun with fable and creeds of human invention, with sectaries of whole nations against all other nations, and sectaries of those sectaries, and each of them against each other. Every sectary except the Quakers has been a persecutor. The key to heaven is not in the keeping of any sect, nor ought the road to it be obstructed by any. Benjamin Rush, who had been instrumental in getting Paine to write Common Sense, refused to see Paine in Philadelphia, writing that Paine's principles avowed in his Age of Reason were so offensive to me that I did not wish to renew my intercourse with him. None of this deterred Paine. He soon joined with Reverend Elihu Palmer to form the Theistic Society and establish a new journal to advance theistic principles. He continued to challenge the stories in the Bible, which he felt were both fables, but also, especially in the Old Testament, to show degrading acts not worthy of a sacred book. Thus, Paine's last years were difficult. His finances dissipated. His health continued to deteriorate. He ended his days living with different supporters in New York City, including Madame de Bonneville, to look after him. After his death on June 8, 1809, his body was taken to New Rochelle, New York, and buried. Most of his former friends chose not to publicly acknowledge his passing. In fact, Paine's legacy of controversy was so strong that in 1813, Thomas Jefferson refused permission to have his letters to Paine published until after his own death, because, as he said, they might draw on me renewed molestations from the irreconcilable enemies of Republican government. Well, there is no statue of Thomas Paine in Washington, D.C. As we look to the future and what his legacy might mean, Raghavan Iyer, the co-founder of the Institute of World Culture here and the author of Parapolitics, writes, Thomas Paine remarked that the religion of the future would strip away all the accretions upon that which is in the beginning. The social structure will have some consonance with what have been forgotten and overlooked, once it is divested of the extravagance of the past, and we have relinquished the superstructure of mummeries. The window within the immortal soul of man was the source of parapolitical vision in antiquity. Every person may give birth to insight. Whether or not she has the good fortune of me now. Everyone has access to wisdom, whether or not a trained philosopher. What one is able to bring forth on any occasion is not one that knows or all that could be released, but yet could be released somewhat where there is love and trust. Now, Paine wrote in the Age of Reason that we know, assuming that we know more than we can tell, that we are somewhat more than just our name and form. Paine wrote that the consciousness of existence, or knowing that we exist, is not necessarily confined to the same form, nor to the same matter. Even in this life, we have not in all cases the same form, nor in any case the same matter that composed our bodies 20 or 30 years ago. And yet we are conscious about being the same person. Thus, there is a continuation of that consciousness beyond form, which one could say is immortality, or the immortality of the soul. But the social structure of the future will also need the moral integrity of individuals. We can't rely on institutions as we did in 1776, and we may be at another inflection point. Reliance on institutions to contain our moral virtues with checks and balances is less supportable, and the refinement and reform of institutions may not be enough with the vested interlocking interests of large-scale groups and professional conformity. Thus, we need to look to Paine's words and go beyond them. Today, Paine's words are a tonic for the authoritarianism infecting our politics, as Mr. Gray writes. They demand from our representatives accountability for effectlessness and the inability to govern for the public good, only for selfish self-preservation, the pursuit of middle-class luxury for some, and the ignorance of the vital nature of universal principles to stand on, exemplify, and live by. And the commercialized media, hiding behind a hodgepodge of false equivalencies, innuendo, and the cynical drumbeat of paranoid fantasy, reflects the echo chambers of social media. Thus, Paine summons us to stand up and calmly use our common sense to pierce claims of facts and pundits, to get to the heart of the matter as best we can. So as one can do one's true duty as a citizen, whether as a voter, as a clear, calm communicator to fellow citizens, and as a participator in evolving day to day a new constitution, worthy and inclusive of our youth. Thus, we need to refocus, not so much on institutions, but on individual and micro communities, communes, collectives, eco-villages, co-housing, where individuals can develop their integrity, their inner integrity, and live and learn in compassionate communities who can act as quiet centers of political action. Education may have an institutional aspect, but its grading and conformity, which affects both students and teachers and corrupts, diminishes the wide-awake questioning of human beings for the sake of learning and lifelong learning for its own sake. Young children can, however, begin to learn and be uplifted by listening to wholesome myths under trees. reflecting upon philosophical questions and asking them as their moral capacity for reasoning, philosophical reasoning grows, appreciating the laws of nature and brotherhood and sisterhood through moral as well as physically enacting ecological interests and relationships in a practical way. And thus, they can have and be in awe of loving, living, and learning under the Liberty Tree. Thomas Paine pointed to and portrayed the mental posture of the citizen of the future. It involves contemplation, and today we might say meditation, on the divine in self-devised ways, interweaving it with philosophical reasoning and in the company of joyful fellowship. These are the threads forward for all of us as citizens to become pathfinders for the future and networks for the human family of the future. As we celebrate this 4th of July together, let us honor the principles of Thomas Paine in our own lives. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maurice. And may I please call on Dr. James Teffer for a vote of thanks for this magnificent Founding Day address. Yeah, I think so.
First, I have to get the balance. Well, ladies and gentlemen, certainly, I think we can celebrate together that it was a very wonderful occasion and a true honoring of the spirit of the founding of the Institute of World Culture, which we are here today to celebrate. And if I might draw from Anne of Green Gables, I'd like to say that I think after listening to Maurice discuss Tom Paine over the years, which I've had that opportunity and privilege, I can see that they are kindred spirits because he brought forward to our attention in a very wonderful way, very lucidly and with feeling, that Paine was a man of profound aspirations. He was also a man committed to principles that were, as Maurice points out, universal. And because they were universal, they illuminated the human mind. That's what makes reason enlightened. And furthermore, when you bring together aspirations, as Paine did, and an adherence to and a love of principles that are foundational, you gestate and give birth to a vision. And Paine and Maurice both love visions to promote the social good. And as we saw, that was true, certainly of Paine. His profound feeling of compassion, which is what motivated his mind and enriched it and enlivened it and regenerated it, his sense of compassion was really extensive and is rarely spoken about so eloquently as we had this evening or this afternoon, because he had tremendous sympathies for the common man. He was every man's voice. He wanted people to throw off the weight of the past, of historical anachronisms that weighed people down. Furthermore, he not only was a voice for every man in the future, he had tremendous sympathy for slaves and for colonials as well. He nailed the British with respect to India, colonial India. He saw what they were doing. He saw this as a worldwide phenomenon of all colonial powers. He also had tremendous sympathy, as you pointed out, Maurice, in terms of the welfare of women. He spoke very articulately about the injustices of the law of divorce. And he felt for their suffering. So he was very much someone whose sympathies were rich and deep and ever abiding. Furthermore, he was certainly a man of principle, as you also pointed out. I love that phrase about principles can penetrate. where armies cannot. Isn't that a magnificent insight of Paine? You don't need armies for principles to become contagious and to grow and to slowly or make a change in the hearts and minds of people over time, if you have that wonderful thing called patience. And so Paine said, with patience and reason, anything is possible. And furthermore, when we have his vision of the social good, as was pointed out by Maurice, he evolved in his thinking. He went from being someone who saw government as a break against, a protection against the vices of society, to seeing in time that government could become something that contributed to the social good by education, by guaranteed annual income that you referred to. And so he began to cast it in a different light. And of course, if you go to social services and look up Social Security, you'll see a quote from Paine. Why? Because he's talking about Social Security way in advance. He was visionary. He was paradoxically one who, because he was so visionary, he became the past, became the present, became the past. So he was quite remarkable in that way. And Maurice's elucidation, what is striking to this student of Paine is you have a way, Maurice, of bringing in concepts, which is very academic and intellectual, but with such a feeling for the seminal element in those concepts that are human and humane, and that entices and that welcome us to consider them, that he does it in such a way that it has a lightness, it has a spirit. You don't get the heavy academic brow. You get something richer, something ebullient, a sense of it's always possible. And then you come to the fourth element. Paine not only had inspiration and principles, and it gestated a vision. And his vision, by the way, was interesting because it was not just about democracy. It was about a universal civilization finding various loci across the globe and generating a moral community, because that's the most important thing. A moral community in which rights naturally are honored because of a sense of duty and obligation and integration. And then finally, you have what makes Paine so remarkable is his fourth thing in the Treatises, not just a triangle, make it four pointed, make it three-dimensional. Paine had courage. That is so vital today. What is wrong with our public officials? They don't have courage. If you don't have courage because you don't have commitment, commitment is something beyond yourself. And this is what Paine exemplified to the max. He had commitment that made him confident that his commitments and his principles were universal and vital to the present and the future and could explain the past. But more importantly, it kept up an attitude of such that he had grace in whatever he did. Try to imagine, as Maurice helped us to do, to go back to the time when he returns to America. This man who was celebrated before he left. He was the greatest selling author of his time. And yet he hardly ever kept a penny. He devoted it all to the causes. But when he came back, he was vilified as a demon, as an infidel. He wasn't allowed to vote in his own country that he helped to form. He wasn't allowed to vote. Think of the insult. What did he do, my friends? Don't get discouraged. He had cheerfulness. He had courage and cheerfulness go together because he had magnanimity and a good heart. Never, up till the moment some audacious minister goes in and tries to get him to convert on his deathbed, he's within 30 minutes of dying. Certainly, Sir Paine, certainly, Mr. Paine, you want now to confess your sins. Get out of my sight. I have no such desire. I believe in the immortality of the soul. And I believe in the future. And so we had a great man being honored by a remarkably wonderful, devoted Painite, who I've had the privilege of having many discussions with over the years. And so I hope you will all join with me in thanking, in a simple way, but a good way, Dr. Maurice Bisheff for his presentation today. Thank you very much.